The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Dibble Institute's April webinar with Dr. Elizabeth Karberg. Rebecca, we can't see your screen right yet, so there we go. Great, thank you. Family environment and instability, how early childhood shapes social maladjustments over time. This is Kay Reed. I'm the executive director of the Dibble Institute, and I'm thrilled to have you all here. I'd like a quick show of hands, so if you can look over in your control panel and find your hand. Would you please raise your hand if you have attended a Dibble webinar before? So if you have attended any webinar over the last many years we've had them, please raise your hand. Let it keep going. Wow. Okay, so it looks like about 20% of you have attended a Dibble webinar before, and so we welcome you. And to all of you who are new, we especially want to welcome you. Let me begin with a little bit of introduction to the Dibble Institute. Rebecca, next slide. So if you can't hear, in your email, this is the information you got in your registration email. If for whatever reason your computer isn't working, just please consult your email. You can always call in. We will be answering questions in the box. We may be able to answer them during the webinar, but most likely afterwards. And if you ask us questions that we can't answer, we will still get back to you. You just raised your hand, so thank you for that. And we'll also be launching some polls. Though many of you who have asked, can I see this again? And yes, we will be archiving it. We will be sending you that link after once it's posted onto our YouTube site in a couple of days. Next slide. So a little bit about the Dibble Institute. These are our founders, Charlie and Helen Dibble. Charlie was an engineer by trade. In his retirement, he started working with young people, and this was in the 70s and 80s. He saw how their family life influenced their outcomes, could either support their outcomes or derail their outcomes, and he wanted to help young people learn how to form and sustain healthy family relationships. So he went to the leading experts of the day and would ask them what they were starting to learn. People like David Olson up in the University of Minnesota and Howard Markman at University of Denver, and they could go on and on about that, but they couldn't tell him how they were taking that information to young people. So Charlie said to himself, you know, we should take this research and turn it into practice and make that information, make those teaching tools available to others who can then go out and teach young people these important skills that relate to building agency in romantic relationships and healthy and strong families in the future. Next slide. So that started the Dibble Institute. The Dibble Institute is a national independent nonprofit. If you go back one, Rebecca. It's a national independent nonprofit. Last year, thanks to people like you who are with us today, because we don't do direct services, we estimate that you reached over 81,000 young people with our materials. And what's interesting about when you teach young people how to gain agency in their intimate relationships, you not only affect sexual behavior, you affect violent behavior, you affect social emotional learning. You know, there's so many outcomes that relationship skills can support. And it's not the only lever, for sure, that we have to pull in a young person's life, but it's certainly, if you don't pull this relationship skills lever, it can lead towards, you know, unhappy results, certainly going forward. So something about our key values. So we develop curricula. We're like a nonprofit publisher, and one of our core beliefs is, next slide please, that we believe in research. And so today we're having Dr. Karberg talk about research. It might be uncomfortable for us, some of us, to hear. Maybe it isn't what we were used to hearing or want to hear, but we really at Dibble really follow the research. And we've seen that it's not that we are swayed by the winds, but as things change slightly, we want to make sure that young people get the advantage of what our most current knowledge is in the field. Next slide. We also are big fans of stable and healthy families. So this means that if there are instances where there's violence in a family, there's no reason to keep the family together, because the children will be, or most likely, it can't be absolute, but it's not a great place to raise children. So we aren't saying you have to stay together at all costs. Certainly, there are good reasons that relationships should change or go away. We also applaud and respect the amazing work that single parents do every day, putting one foot in front of the other to do a great job for their kids. And so we applaud them, and we applaud any family form that is safe, stable, and healthy. And we know from research that married couples tend, on average, and all the other caveats about research, to have those better outcomes for children. And we know that many, many young people, not all, but many young people want to develop healthy married family relationships. And so part of our mission is to help people find that family form, develop that family form that they aspire to. Next slide. And lastly, we believe that all people should be treated with respect, and all relationships do better with relationship skills. So we intentionally, and have for years, drafted and created our materials to be very inclusive of diverse young people, of diverse relationships. And it's really all about mutually, how shall I say this, understood expectations in relationships. And there are some general caveats about healthy relationships that go beyond who you love. It's like they're rules just for human beings to learn how to connect and be in healthy relationships together. So we integrate that into our curricula. So finally, Rebecca. Oh, let me introduce Rebecca. So the woman turning the slides, it's her inaugural day, so we're so happy to have her here, is Rebecca Powell. Hi, Rebecca.
Hello.
So there's Rebecca. And now I'm going to introduce Dr. Karberg. Elizabeth is a fatherhood expert at Child Trends. She has led research projects related to parent-child interactions with a focus on fathers. She leads several tasks across multiple projects that focus on fathers, including young fathers, the Responsible Fatherhood Clearinghouse, and Healthy Marriage and Responsible Fatherhood Training and Technical Assistance. She contributes to research at Child Trends related to the Hispanic Marriage and Family Center, related to marriage and fatherhood topics, as well as childhood development among Latinos. She's engaged in basic research using observational data of fathers and their children to study fathering. And she's most interested in supporting families and children through parenting and relationship education. Elizabeth just recently returned from a maternity leave. She has 2 twins, count them 1-2 twins, and a child under the age of 3. She and her husband and her 3 boys and 2 boy cats are all sheltering in place in Baltimore, Maryland. So Elizabeth, we're thrilled and really appreciate you coming here today and look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that introduction, Kay, and thank you everyone for being here. I know that all of our schedules are a little strange at the moment, so I'm very grateful that you made time for this talk. Today I'm going to be talking about how family stability and instability are linked with children's social outcomes. And after that introduction, I just want to say one reason why I consider myself a fatherhood researcher, but I study the family at large, is because, and I'll get into this a little bit more toward the implications of this talk, when there are changes in the family, oftentimes fathers suffer most because they're most likely to leave the family, and their involvement changes just because of their access to their kids. So I'll talk about that later, but if you're wondering, why is a fatherhood researcher talking about family stability and instability, that is why. Next slide, please. By the end of this webinar, you will learn how families in America are changing and what are common contexts for children's early family experiences, whether instability in families is linked with children's social outcomes, why instability in families is linked with children's social outcomes, and what this means for programming and interventions to support children's positive development, as well as for those of you working with families as a whole. Next slide, please. I'm going to begin with some background on the subject and this project at large. Next slide. The research I'm going to talk about today is funded through an NIH grant that includes several papers, a brief, and other dissemination efforts. I'm going to focus on a brief that was released in 2019 in August and is available through the Child Trends website or as a PDF in the handout section of this webinar, and also will be archived on Dibble's website. Each of these products has a slightly different focus, but in general, the idea behind this larger project is to examine the link between family context, specifically the parents' romantic relationships and their living arrangements, ideally or theoretically to which a child is exposed, and then that child's social outcomes.
Elizabeth, I'm going to stop you for a second. I'm getting, so would people who are listening raise their hands if they can hear us? I'm getting some feedback that they're not hearing us. Okay, so people are hearing us. Okay, I'll just tell people to turn on the volume on their computers. Okay, sorry to get in your way. Just wanted to make sure. Thank you, everybody. I'll put down your hands. Okay.
So why focus on child aggression and social competence? These are key aspects of social development because they shape multiple domains of development throughout childhood, such as academic success, romantic relationships in adolescence and beyond, as well as overall well-being. And why family contexts? There have been a lot of change in American families in the last 50 to 70 years. And family characteristics, such as marital or residential status and changes in family structure, are important environmental factors that influence parenting because they determine the amount of time parents spend with children, the quality of parent-child interactions, and the resources available to them. These changes in the family are particularly important because over the last 60 years, increasing numbers of children have experienced some degree of family instability. In general, throughout this project, we focused on early childhood family instability and the mechanisms that can tell us why it's linked with maladaptive social outcomes and for whom. Next slide, please. Social competence is an essential life skill. It includes behaviors like cooperation, empathy, assertion, self-control, and responsibility. And as children develop, we expect some degree of social incompetence. So an example of this is toddlers are known for their aggression. They throw tantrums, they hit, they throw things, they bite. When they have big feelings, they act out aggressively, physically. It becomes problematic when these aggressive, socially incompetent behaviors persist into the school years. We expect school-aged children to be able to maintain social relationships, regulate their emotions, and respond to the emotions of others. And when teens in particular are aggressive, it can manifest as bullying, physical assault, and other behaviors that may lead to involvement with the criminal justice system or other negative outcomes. Next slide, please. There's a 2016 paper from Stephen Ruggles that has a series of beautiful graphs and figures to illustrate what I mean when I say that family instability is increasingly common. This figure to the far right shows a shift away from marriage toward more cohabitation and unpartnered statuses since 1970. The gray and orange parts of the figure represent the proportion of men and women aged 25 to 29 who are unpartnered or cohabiting. And you can see that these colors take up more of the figure in recent years, represented on the right of the figure, than in 1960, represented on the left. The second figure, underneath the text on the slide, shows the steadily increasing rate of divorce since 1970, really since the 1800s, but that's when the rate accelerated. This figure paints a somewhat different picture from other recent reports about divorce because this analysis adjusts for the age distribution of married women. But the takeaway is that divorce is increasing, marriage is decreasing, and other types of families are becoming more common. Next slide, please. So that's family instability in a nutshell. And what does this mean for children? These changes in marriage, cohabitation, and divorce result in a changing context for childbearing, namely that more children have been born outside of the context of marriage since 1970. And this is important because these children, 40% or so, as you can see in the figure on this page, are more likely than their counterparts born to married parents to experience their parents separate and or repartner. You'll notice that this figure only goes to 2010, but data extending to 2018 from Bowling Green State University that releases a lot of very digestible reports on this topic shows that this trend continues, that we're still seeing more children born out of wedlock into kind of diverse family contexts. Next page, please. Okay, and Rebecca, could you pull up poll 1, please? Okay, before getting into the next little bit, I just want to know how many of you have heard of heterogeneity effects.
Oh, Rebecca, it looks like you stumped them. No, Rebecca, Elizabeth, you stumped them. 89% say no, they've not. Or you want to show us the poll, Rebecca? 89% no, they've never heard of the heterogeneity effect, and 11% have. So we're all going to learn something new today.
Okay, this is a relatively new concept to me too, and I think it's very interesting. I will get into that in just a minute, and I'm happy to answer more questions about it at the end. So why do we care about children's changing family contexts? When we look at whether there's an association between these changing family contexts and children's outcomes, research finds a clear link between instability and social maladjustment, in particular aggression, throughout childhood, but particularly all this in early childhood. It's unclear, though, why we find this link. One factor at play is that not all children are equally likely to experience instability. For example, marriages are more stable than non-marriages, making the experience of instability less likely. Partly because of this, we've heard from researchers and policymakers and the media for some time now that marriage is best for families. But it's important to know that it's not marriage in and of itself that confers benefit, or at least that's what research is suggesting and kind of the underlying hypothesis of this project is. Rather, it's the stability of marriage that's so beneficial. And one reason why this is kind of the underlying assumption here is that research shows, this is somewhat limited, but kids tend to have similar outcomes, especially in the social developmental domain, when they live with stably married parents versus stably cohabiting parents. So this suggests that it's the stability, not the family structure per se. Another important component of this is that although marriage tends to be more stable than other family structures, instability resulting from a marriage might be worse for children than instability resulting from other family structures. And this is known as the heterogeneity effect. So that is a term to describe something that is not expected or not as common, but more detrimental than when it's more expected or more common. So instability that results from a largely stable union is more upsetting and therefore associated with worse outcomes than something that is quote unquote expected, like instability that results from a largely unstable union. This research tends to be, the research on heterogeneity effects tends to be seen more in research on prisons and incarceration, but it's kind of slowly being extended to the family instability literature. So this idea might help explain some of the variability we see in kids' outcomes when they experience instability. Importantly, family stability and marriage are also entangled with income. So stability, marriage, and higher incomes are all protective factors. For this reason, today I'm going to focus on family structure, relationship status, and income in the context of family instability and kids' outcomes. Other parts of this project examine how the quality of family relationships, so the parent-child relationship focusing on the father, and parent-parent interactions focusing on co-parenting, explain this association, but I'm not going to get into that so much today. I also want to note that it's important to consider the timing of instability. Developmental theory suggests that early adversity that kids might experience when they're born into poverty that leads to food insecurity, housing insecurity, insecurity around other primary needs, as well as potentially less time with parents during a developmentally critical age for the parent-child interaction can be most influential. So it's possibly more stressful for children than later adversity. And this is why we're focusing on instability in the early years, but looking at outcomes longitudinally. Particularly when we think about adversity in the family as well, the family is most central to kids' early developments before peers really come into play. So that's why we focus on early and middle childhood. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to get a little bit into the methodology, and again, I'm happy to answer more questions about this at the end. Next slide. We used the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing data. This study includes a sample of mothers and their children born between 1998 and 2000 in large urban US areas. Mothers were recruited in hospitals at the birth of their child, and fathers were identified from there. I'm not going to say much more about the father piece of this because we're not using any father data, but this is really rich data because it follows kids from birth to age 15, and it has data from mothers, fathers, and children. The overall sample is roughly 5,000 mothers and children, and our analytic sample includes about 1,500 children who consistently lived with their mother at least 50% of the time from birth to age 9, and whose mothers experienced no or one instance of family instability, which I will describe a little bit more in the next slide. This selection criteria was used so that we could pinpoint the children who were exposed to the mother's instability, which is the report of family instability that we have. Next slide, please. For our measures, we compared children who experienced no family instability versus one instance. We dichotomized this as none versus one, and the one instance captures whether mothers reported changing residential romantic partnership status, such as moving in with a romantic partner or divorcing a spouse, at some point between birth and age 9 survey wave. At each point in time of the study, mothers reported whether they were living with the child's biological father, a different romantic partner, or no romantic partner. Starting at age 5, mothers also reported whether they had experienced any additional changes in their residential partner between the points in time when they were surveyed, which were roughly 2 years apart at that point. This variable captures resident status, but does not differentiate between married and unmarried mothers when defining whether a transition has occurred, as long as they're resident. So that means that when a cohabiting mother marries her partner, it doesn't count as a form of family instability in the way that we're measuring it. And we dichotomize this variable because most mothers who experienced any instability experienced one instance only. A dichotomized variable in conjunction with mother's relationship status also allows us to identify the type of transition occurring, such as a divorce, a non-marital breakup, or the addition of a co-residential partner, which allows for clearer interpretation of our results. We also conducted exploratory analyses, which revealed little difference in the level of social competence or aggression that youth reported associated with each additional instance of family instability beyond the first one. For adolescents whose mothers were married or cohabiting at birth, one instance of family instability is a divorce or a breakup from the child's father. For adolescents whose mothers were not living with a partner at birth, one instance of family instability means that a romantic partner moved into the home. Social competence was measured with the social skills rating scale when the child was 15 years old, and this was child self-reported. And this assesses behaviors like I went over in the earlier slides, like cooperation, responsibility, things like that. Aggression was measured with the child behavior checklist, which was mother reported, also when the child was 15 years old. This assesses behaviors like getting into fights and bullying other kids. To capture mother's relationship status or family structure at birth, we created a categorical variable with 3 values: married, cohabiting, and not living with a partner. This last category, not living with a partner, includes mothers who are in non-co-residential dating relationships, as well as those who were not in a romantic relationship at all. And income was measured when the child was 15 years old, with a dichotomous variable indicating whether the household income was below 200% of the federal poverty line or greater than or equal to 200% of the federal poverty line. This is the cutoff we use at Child Trends and many other organizations use to indicate low income. Next slide, please. For this brief, we examined differences in the relationship between family instability in the first 9 years of life and adolescent social competence and aggression by mother's relationship status when the child was born and household income when the child was 15. Note that these are not changes over time in social outcomes, rather mean differences by group. Some of the other reports that we have coming out of this project do look at these outcomes longitudinally, but for this in particular, it's a point in time when the kids are 15. So the group differences that we're looking at include children born to mothers who are married, cohabiting, or neither, and children who live in low-income families versus higher-income families. Next slide, please. Okay, getting into our results. Next slide, please. Looking first at the association between family instability and social development overall, as context for this figure, 35% of adolescents in our sample experienced one instance of family instability from birth to age 9. Family instability was positively associated with aggression, but not statistically associated with social competence. And before going on to the next slides, I want to talk about the scales of these scores quickly before moving on. So these two scales of social development do not have the same range. The scale range for social competence is 3 to 24, and for aggression, it's 0 to 1.6. I'm showing them on the same figure for ease of presentation, but I'm not trying to compare these scores, so don't look at these and think that they should be on the same scale or they should be easily comparable. They're kind of their own separate entities. For the aggression figures in particular, I can see how you might be thinking, these kids have such low levels of aggression. Are the scores between groups really statistically different? They look so similar. And that's a completely valid thought. So I just want to address it by saying that the scores on the CBCL scale, at least the way that we created the composite, have a very narrow range. And even though this looks like a small scale with very little difference between the groups, it is meaningful for a child's behavior. So what it might look like in the real world is the difference between being aggressive sometimes in one behavior assessed, like being cruel, mean, or bullying others, versus being aggressive often across one behavior or sometimes across multiple behaviors. And the reason this is meaningful in real life is because at this age, any of these behaviors is concerning. So when we get beyond just one being a problem sometimes versus kind of all the time or multiple of these behaviors, it's concerning. We're getting in behaviors like bullying, disobedience, and being threatening. And ideally, we want the kids to be scoring 0. And one reason why these scores are so low on average is because a lot of the kids are on the low end of that. The scale is pretty skewed positively for that reason. Okay, next slide, please. Moving on to the association between relationship status and family structure at birth and social development. As context here, 37% of mothers were married at the time of their birth, 31% were cohabiting, and 32% were neither. Adolescents whose mothers were married had lower aggression scores and higher social competence scores than their counterparts. Next slide, please. Next, examining the association between household income and social development. As context, 49% of households in our sample had an annual income greater than or equal to 200% of the federal poverty level, and 51% had an annual income of less than 200%. So this is just to say that there is good variability in terms of family structure as well as income. Higher income was associated with higher social competence and lower aggression compared to lower income. Next slide, please. Putting this all together, we wanted to see how each of these factors interact to try to determine whether instability, resources, or family structure matter more or matter above the influence of the others for adolescents' social outcomes. You'll recall from previous slides that instability was not associated with social competence. When we looked more closely at this association for different groups of kids, we found that instability is associated with social competence, but only for adolescents whose mothers are neither married nor cohabiting. And we found that this association was in a direction that we did not expect. It would be counter to our hypothesis. So for these children, when they experience their mother's partner moving into their home, they report greater social competence than their counterparts whose mothers remain unpartnered. And I'll talk about this a little more in a moment when I get to the implication slides. I also want to note for this slide and the next few that the axis on the figure does not start at 0, just to show the interaction better. I know that that is not best practice, but it would be very difficult to see otherwise. Next slide, please. Adding in income, we found that this effect of relationship status at birth and instability on children's social competence is driven by children living in households with low income. So instability is associated with greater social competence when mothers gain a partner only when they also have low household income. And you'll notice among these low income households, kids living with divorced parents are less socially competent than their counterparts whose parents stay married, but this difference was not statistically significant. So the only one here that's statistically meaningful is the orange line. Next slide, please. Moving on to these interactions predicting aggression, instability is only associated with aggression for children whose mothers divorce, which supports a heterogeneity effect hypothesis, which I'll get into more in a little bit. Next slide, please. And divorce is only associated with aggression when adolescents live in higher income households. This further supports a heterogeneity effect hypothesis. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to begin by quickly summarizing these results, and then I'll get into the implications. Next slide. Just to go over it all again, family instability is linked with adolescent aggression. This is family instability in early childhood. This association is driven by families experiencing a divorce and with higher income. Family instability, on the other hand, is not associated with social competence for our overall sample. But when we looked at group differences, it was positively linked with social competence when a partner moved into the home. This was only true when the family had low income. Next slide, please. And Rebecca, can you pull up poll number 2? So just as I'm talking through the implications of this, it would be helpful to know how many of you work with youth who have experienced family instability or who you kind of expect to have unpredictable or unstable family environments. Okay, the vast majority of you, it looks like. Thank you, Rebecca. Can we pull back up the slides? Okay. So I'm going to try to talk through in the best, most applicable way I can what these relatively descriptive findings mean for the larger fields of research, practice, and policy. And I know many of you from your registration information want to know what this information means for direct services, especially related to families and youth. So I'm going to try to touch on that. I'm going to begin with the findings around aggression. That instability is linked with aggression only for the groups where instability is arguably least expected. So again, this supports a heterogeneity effect hypothesis, which suggests that family change is linked with social outcomes when it's less expected. So the kids most likely to experience family instability, those from cohabiting and unmarried, non-cohabiting families, those that are most likely to kind of be touched by the services that we all that you all provide, that we study at Child Trends, that are kind of the kids that we're focused on most. They have higher levels of aggression regardless of their experience of family instability. And this is kind of an interesting and confusing at times point, because it could mean a lot of things. This could speak to other stressors, potentially even ACEs or early childhood experiences in these adverse early childhood experiences in these children's lives. They might reach a point where added stress does not raise already high levels of aggression. This is a question of cumulative stress versus a threshold level of stress shaping children's outcomes. We didn't look at that in this research, but there is research to suggest that it can be both, that, you know, children can kind of reach a threshold level of stressors and just kind of max out in terms of poor outcomes. And it can be that their outcomes get worse and worse and worse with each additional stressor. So that's something to kind of keep in mind, that it's looking like in their context of being low income and having unmarried parents, when they experience instability, it's not necessarily making their aggression worse. But keep in mind that their aggression is already high and higher than their counterparts that we're kind of talking about as the significant group here. An alternative hypothesis, which kind of is the counter to the heterogeneity effect hypothesis, that least expected outcomes have the most impact. The normality of these changes in the family. So if you if you're born to an unmarried mother, you might not expect her to remain unmarried for the rest of your life. Or if your parents are cohabiting, you might expect that they are eventually going to either marry or break up. So the normality of that change might mean that kids don't feel the effect as much or react to them as negatively. And again, it could be that there are other kind of correlated things driving kids' behaviors here that are washed out when we look at instability by itself. And I also want to say that the quality of the relationship could really is an important factor that we did not look into here. So we know that non-marriages tend to be of lower quality than marriages. That's not the case for everyone, but it speaks to their tendency toward instability. And the quality of the relationship, not the stability or instability or the family structure in and of itself, could be driving kids' outcomes here. Our findings don't mean that healthy, stable relationships are not important for these children to be exposed to. We know that kids suffer in other developmental domains when they experience their unmarried mother's relationship instability. It's just something to keep in mind for your own service provision that the kids that are expecting the instability least might be affected most. The fact that there is no change in aggression from relatively high levels among those with unmarried parents who experience instability also points to the fact that these kids need services, just maybe not so focused on instability. Maybe they need services that first address other stressors in their life. And again, healthy relationships are essential for all families, and avoiding instability, which is an ACE, will benefit children. But this might provide some information about how to triage wraparound services based on the context in which children experience family instability. So turning to our findings around social competence. This is something that I was surprised about, and honestly only have guesses as to what explains our results. It's also pretty contradictory to other research, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So I did not expect to see youth whose mothers had a new partner move into the home report better social competence than their counterparts whose mothers remained uncoupled. And this finding, again, stands in contrast to other research that suggests that a new partner moving into the home relates to worse academic and cognitive outcomes for kids. So the difference could be in the outcome. We're looking at social development, and other research is focused on, again, academic or cognitive development. And also of note is that the scale that we have, the social skills rating scale, measures cooperation, empathy, assertion, self-control, and responsibility, which are all skills that theoretically could be tested and matured when a new partner moves in. So you could be kind of forced to become more cooperative, more self-reliant, have more self-control, and take on more responsibility in the home, especially at the age of 15. On the other hand, though, realistically, many of the youth I've interacted with could just as likely respond by digging in their heels and refusing to be cooperative, responsible, or exhibiting self-control. But one takeaway from this is that when you're aware of youth in this situation, work with them to recognize the opportunity to grow in this domain, to become cooperative, to become responsible, to kind of take on these social competence skills and practice them. Another point is it's unlikely, given other research with cohabiting couples, that a new partner moving in provides any economic benefit to youth, because cohabiting couples are not likely to pool their resources. However, that's not something that we can really look at here. So if these couples are pooling resources, it makes sense that gaining a partner, and therefore pooled resources, is most beneficial in a low-income context where any additional money matters more than a higher income context. And that's just something to keep in mind too, for individual cases you work with. That might be one reason why this helps alleviate kind of stress that can lead to social incompetence in these youth. So one additional thought is that the finding could be driven by the biological father moving in. Many of these parents, these biological parents in this sample, have dynamic relationships where dads are moving in and out multiple times throughout the survey period. We didn't test for this in our analysis, but it is kind of an interesting thought as to why these kids are doing better with the instability. Both of these findings around aggression and social competence emphasize that there's a group of youth that have a high need for services. Adolescents in low-income households and whose mothers are stably live without a partner. This is not new information. I think many of you probably know this from your own experiences, and researchers have known this for some time. These kids generally have worse social outcomes than their counterparts, and what seems to set these families apart, at least from what we can determine from our analyses and the variables that we examined, is their financial vulnerability. Supporting single parents, in this case mothers, by alleviating parenting stress and financial insecurity may be a key way to help these youth. What is new from our research is the need to be particularly aware, in addition to these kids, of children's outcomes and service needs when they experience stress in the family that is relatively unexpected. Next slide, please. And I wanted to speak briefly about what these findings mean in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we've heard from experts that being quarantined and being under further economic stress is a recipe for a higher risk of domestic violence among some families. These are families who might, under normal circumstances, quote unquote normal, choose to separate, but can't because there are no hotels, no Airbnbs, no family that can take them in because of shelter-in-place orders or their own health concerns. It's possible that people can't leave bad relationships right now, which might be as or more stressful for children than instability. And they're exposed to poor quality or conflicted relationships within their home. We know that family functioning is key for kids' outcomes. So other research that we're doing in this project, for example, we don't look at domestic violence, but looking at co-parenting, that is a major driver in explaining kids' outcomes in this context of family instability. This pandemic is also already affecting families' financial security, especially among lower income workers. There's a study of hourly workers in the midst of data collection that's been able to capture the effects of COVID so far on working families, and it released some figures last week to illustrate their findings. You can find this by searching snapshot of the COVID crisis impact on working families, but the gist is that there are drastic reductions in work hours and increases in job losses in March of this year. And there have also been a deterioration in child and parent mental health that corresponds with the onset of the pandemic, as well as the job loss and insecurity that goes along with it. I could go on about the implications of this, not only the lost wages, but suddenly needing to feed kids meals that were previously provided by schools. But this is just so far two points as to additional stresses for these types of families in this study that they kind of suddenly have to face. So one additional thought is related to father involvement and access to their kids. So again, I didn't get into this talk, but because my research is so focused on fathers, I've been thinking about this. And in the context of instability, the father-child relationship is really likely to suffer because fathers overwhelmingly are the ones that leave the home when parents break up. Instability limits their access to their kids, which fundamentally changes their relationships. In addition to changes that result from the stress of instability for the fathers themselves. It can manifest as poor quality father-child interaction, poor quality co-parenting, which can lead to mothers blocking the fathers from accessing their kids, all kinds of things going on here. So in the current context, one additional stress for kids and their fathers who have already experienced family instability is how they can see each other when they're quarantined separately. I know that there's a lot of, people are very savvy with video chats, phone calls, Facebook, Zoom, all of that. But there's something different about, especially for young kids, maybe adolescents get it a little bit more, but about being able to hug your dad or actually physically be with him. There are also implications of the pandemic for child support. How can fathers continue paying child support if they've lost their jobs? It's one of the few government debts that will not be forgiven during the crisis, at least as the current regulations stand. So taken together, the increased stress on families like those in this study who can't separate, might have maladaptive and even abusive patterns of interaction as a result, who have more financial stress than normal and can't access their kids. All of this is so important to consider right now as practitioners working with these families. How can services still reach them? What are some innovative ways to help them when they may not have any privacy or have lower executive functioning capacity right now to regulate emotional outbursts or other effects of stress? For example, how can providers perform violence or mental health screenings when families are in each other's space kind of all the time? I want to point to some resources in the handout section. The first is the first website linked in the resources PDF is to Urban's website, Urban Institute. They released a conceptual model just this week, I believe, which is a web of stabilizing supports when children face instability. So it's applicable to this project at large, but particularly in the context of COVID. The second website is resources from Child Trends on supporting children's healthy social and emotional development in the context of COVID. So both of these are kind of interactive, go through the multiple dynamic sources of instability and related supports for children and families. It might be particularly helpful to you at this time. So Urban's model, for example, goes through when a family is faced with instability, the various stabilizing supports, such as a healthy, reliable, and nurturing relationship with at least one adult, and kind of all the different potential supports at different levels of a child's environment that can be played up or emphasized right now. Our current context and what it means for families like those in this study further supports the need for policies and programs to help alleviate parenting stress and financial insecurity and to provide stability when and where possible. I know that this is on the government's mind, particularly the financial piece. So I urge you, I'm sure you already are, to think about what you can do as practitioners through telehealth or other virtual services to support these families. Next slide. I'm happy to take questions now. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That was wonderful. We do have some questions. Excuse me. Some are related to marriage and divorce, but I'm going to go to the ones that relate more specifically to your conversation here with us today. Are the outcomes regarding a parent/partner moving in only relate to a male moving in the household, or is there any data on females moving in or out of the household?
That's a great question. So the Fragile Families does have information on the gender of the partner, but it's considered, it's not accessible to everyone. So I have access to the public use files, and I can't determine whether the partner moving in or out is male or female, but I will say these are all families that at parents who at one point, mothers who were coupled with a man to have the child. So the vast majority are male partners. Some other research that's published, the Fragile Families, kind of looks into this, but it doesn't look like this is a great sample for studying same-sex couples.
Okay. What about children who have a parent in the military? I'm assuming they don't see married parent, but you know, if your parent all of a sudden leaves, or they're in the military. So, what do you any data from this study about military service?
So in this study, no, this does not. This is a civilian population, but other research. Granted, the research I know is a little bit older. But it suggests that deployment is incredibly stressful. Like we think of it as potentially not because there's this great honor in being in the military, which makes sense. But from a child's perspective, it's pretty much as detrimental as a parent being incarcerated in terms of the stress to the kid, especially when they're younger. It's very difficult for them to understand why a parent is gone, like good reasons versus not as good reasons for them being gone.
Right. So that even though you would expect that the heterogeneity effect would say your dad's in the military or your mom's in the military, you expect them to go away, but it's hard to tell a 2 or 3 year old that, right?
Mm-hmm.
They can't figure it out. We have one person comment. In my experience, the child who has 2 adults to interact with are more flexible in their interactions because they've had more than one way to be played with, held, taken care of with ordinary everyday needs. To me, this gives them more social competence. So is social competence also just the fact that there's 2 adults in the household and you get more, different experiences with 2 adults?
That's a really interesting thought. I could see that in early childhood. I would think for adolescence, that other factors might be at play where, I guess, depending on the individual, I wouldn't see them necessarily so eager to interact like that with a new partner off the bat, that it would take, I don't know, that, yeah, and that they might have other adults or individuals in their lives that they kind of go to for that.
Right.
But that's a really interesting point that I would love to look into. That's a good hypothesis.
Yeah. Okay. What is the name of the social skills inventory you used when you were doing
The
this?
social skills rating scale,
Social skills
the
rating scale.
SSRS.
Okay. So here's a long one. Seems to me that today's nuclear family idea is failing. This is harmful because we do not live in community where other adults participate in early childhood experiences. Shouldn't we be promoting community?
Yes, I think that's a fantastic idea. I don't think that our society is set up well for it in general, but you see this in some racial and ethnic groups more than others. Oh, and I wish I had linked this too. There's a recent paper out, I'm forgetting the researcher, but essentially looking at this um, in Black Americans and finding that instability is particularly kind of not detrimental in a way. I don't want to say that, but Black children fare much better than we would expect when there's family instability because they have these larger social webs and networks to fall on, that there really is kind of a village to support them. That is, as Urban would kind of talk about, a stabilizing um, factor in their lives. So I think that there needs to be much more research on that. I would love for policies to support that. I think that that's an incredible point. And it seems like so many of the programs that we've worked with at Child Trends try to provide that for their families. And it seems to be kind of a major thing that a major indicator of how well they're going to do in the program and afterwards is whether they can build up these supports within the community so that they have a village to fall back on because no family or individual is going to go the rest of their lives without adversity. After completing programs and getting these things figured out, they need the skills to be able to handle it themselves as well as the support networks in place to help them through it when things get hard.
Yeah, there's a lot of data, I think, on ACEs that if you're in struggling, like having one stable adult can help. So
Mm-hmm.
probably more than one stable adult will even help more. So here's
Mm-hmm.
another. Any data on protective factors? Why do some children do better than others?
Yeah, so there is quite a bit of research out there, although it's very siloed. I don't know that anyone's really brought it all together. The things that really come to mind actually are at the individual level. So intrinsic characteristics of the child that serve as protective factors, like um, temperament. There's some kids, they call it the differential susceptibility model, that are just differentially susceptible to stressors. So the idea behind this is that two completely different kids could be exposed to the exact same stressor, and one will come out thriving and one will come out kind of flailing, just because of who they are as individuals. And the problem with that is it's hard to intervene. You can't, change a child's biology to address that. So I think there are other people kind of looking at intervention points to determine what protective factors are. And I think Kay, you just pointed to one, having at least one reliable, nurturing adult that is kind of stably in a kid's life is something. The problem with these other protective factors that aren't kind of biologically driven is it's hard to determine. It's hard for things like that to be so stable over a life. So they might be protective at one point in time, but they could go away and then the kid doesn't have that anymore. Um, so it just kind of leads to difficulties in measuring it, in variability in the outcomes that we see in the research. There needs to be more
Research.
general research on this.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Karberg, for your great webinar today. People are certainly appreciative, and we have a ton of, you're going to be busy because I'm going to be sending you these questions. We will, those of us we didn't get to, those questions we didn't get to, we will certainly answer them individually. Rebecca, the next slide, please. So the Dibble Institute hosts there's how you can contact her, ekarberg@childtrends.org. Okay, keep going. Next month, we will have yet another webinar. We do them every month on the second Wednesday of the month. This one will be available in a few days. You will also get a certificate of completion that you can download. Also, all the reports and links that Dr. Karberg mentioned will be included. So the next one, Rebecca. Next month, our topic is, okay, keep in touch. I'm hurrying along here. You guys trying to get to the end before everybody hangs off at 2 o'clock. Next month, May 13th, we're going to have a group from West Virginia talking about how they scaled up a very large pregnancy prevention program in their rural area. So you can go to the Dibble website, register for it there. We also are doing weekly lessons from our Mind Matters programs. That's also on our landing page of our homepage, and hope you can join us for that. And thank you again, Elizabeth. Thank you, Rebecca. And we'll see everybody next month. Take good care. Stay strong, steady, and safe. Bye-bye.